all being here today. An exciting audience. So welcome officially to the Comparative Literature Luncheon series at Penn State. And I'm going to pass the table over to my colleague Hoda al-Shaki to introduce today's speaker. But before I do, I wanted to mention that our next session in the luncheon series will be after the break, the Monday after the break, which I believe is November 30th. And the speaker will be David Cunningham from the University of Westminster. And he's speaking on the novel of capitalism, I believe is what it's called. His title is the historical novel of contemporary capitalism. And that's, again, in 2 weeks from today at the same time and same place. Without any further ado, what else, right?
I'm honored to introduce our esteemed guest today. Professor R.A. Judy is Professor of Critical and Cultural Studies in the Department of English at the University of Pittsburgh, where he teaches courses related to the field of American literature and culture, African literature, Arab literature, contemporary Islamic thought, as well as world literature, and literary theory and criticism. He is a member of the Editorial Collective of Boundary 2, an international journal of literature and culture, a recipient of prestigious honors from the Ford and Mellon Foundations. He has been a Fulbright Fellow at the Institut Bourguiba de Langues Vivantes at the University of Tunis. Professor Judy is the author of Disforming the American Canon, the Vernacular of African Arabic American Slave Narrative in 1992, and has edited numerous special issues and dossiers for Boundary 2, among which are Tunisia dossier in 2012, Ralph Ellison, The Next 50 Years, 2003, Sociology Hesitant, W.E. Du Bois's Dynamic Thinking in 2001, Reasoning and the Logic of Things Global, 1999, and Scattered Speculations on Value, exchanged between Etienne Balibar, Antonio Negri, and Gayatri Spivak. He is currently finishing up the manuscript for a book project under contract with Fordham University Press entitled Thinking Disorder, Essays of Poetic Socialities, as well as working on a subsequent book project tentatively titled Fanon, the Last Negro and the New Man. Professor Judy has also published numerous essays in the areas of philosophy, contemporary Islamic philosophy, literary cultural theory, music, and Arabic and American literatures. His paper today is entitled Fanon on the Question of Species, Humanism as Restlessness, al-qalqin, and I'm honored to introduce him. Please join me in welcoming Professor Judy.
Thank you for a very generous and, quite frankly, humbling introduction. I hope I shall warrant the esteem. Thank you for inviting me here. It is always a pleasure to visit this part of the state, although you're only 2 hours away. At times it seems like you're across the ocean. And any occasion to drive through the hills, I always go through 99, the back way. You know, I look forward to lots of stoplights. One has to be careful at Belfont, but you know. Imma ba'd. The title of my talk comes from the third book project that Huda mentioned on Fanon. And I'm going to march through a lot of the areas that she listed that I'm involved in. And so doing this is going to be itself a kind of performance of thinking disorder, which I also understand to be scenes of reading world literature at odds with the current notion of the world. On the question of species, at the beginning of Les Damnés de la Terre, Wretched of the Earth, Fanon states, according to Constance Farrington's 1968 English language translation, national liberation, national reawakening, restoration of the nation to the people or commonwealth, whatever the name used, whatever the latest expression, decolonization is always a violent act. At whatever level we study, individual encounters, a change of name for a sports club, the guest list at a cocktail party, members of a police force or a board of directors, or of a state or private bank. Decolonization is quite simply the replacing of a certain species of men by another species of men without any period transition. There is a total, complete, and absolute substitution. This is how he begins his account entitled On Violence. And the gist of that account is that species of humans are formed in violence, violence as a process of speciation. To fully appreciate this, let us give careful, close considered attention to what he states about decolonization as the replacing of one species by another. Every English language edition, and here Richard Philcox simply follows Farrington's translation, renders the passage we are attending to as decolonization is quite simply the replacing of a certain species of men by another species of men, as I just read. This is idiomatic enough of a translation which seeks to parallel or match the idiomatic expression of Fanon's French. Yet, while all living worldly language is idiomatic, even when global in range, idioms can, and in this case they do, participate in and share a common conceptual frame and lineage, which is what the Farrington translation buries or sets aside. More specifically, her translation elides the epistemological tradition that Fanon expressly strives to rupture, or the rupture of which is an aspect of decolonization. To get at this, let's consider what Fanon wrote in French. La décolonisation est très simplement le remplacement d'un espace d'homme pour notre espace d'homme. An important correction, I must point out. He does not use the phrase certain species, but rather d'un espace d'homme, one species of, I will now say here, humankind. As I was saying, the noun he uses is espace, which of course Petit Robert recalls that the earliest literary occurrence of this term is in 1200 to designate aspect, the sensible appearance of things, or the immediate object of sensorial knowledge, la connaissance sensible, which of course is the ancient philosophical sense of the term. Theologically, of course, espace refers to the body and blood of Christ, communion under the two species, bread and wine. The current modern sense of the term, dating from 1260, is a set of beings or things having common characteristics. In this sense, besides category, or quality, or sort, espace has as a synonym genre, and I'm going to circle back to this, which Robert etymologically derives from the Latin genus, generis, origin, naissance. More precisely, it is synonymous with the second definition that Robert gives for the term genre, the principle being le genre humain, humankind, described quantitatively as, again, the totality of all men, and is synonymous with what we call humanity, humanité, as well as espace. Now, our English noun genre, the first literary occurrence of which is around 1770, in the correspondence between Jenner and Garrick, derives from the second Robert sense, synonymous with espace, with an exclusively literary denotation designating kind, sort, or style of writing. Significantly enough, however, the OED entry tells us, or sends us, directly to gender for the etymology of the English usage, which derives from the Anglo-Saxon or Anglo-Norman Middle French genre, as does the French term genre, and which was used in the sense of kind, inclusive of all sorts of things or beings, from sex to race to people, well from the 12th century through to the 17th century, during which time we have in Anglo-Norman and Middle French humain genre, bringing us back to the French genre humain, humanity, humankind. Now, this conceptual genealogy, and thank you for your indulgence, in which there is both the archaic, close identification of genre with sex, as well as the modern distinction between the two, is very much at play in Fanon's usage of the term espace. The modern distinction occurs with the advent in the 18th century of what Sylvia Wynter, and this is the point of that etymology to earn this moment, calls the ethno-class conception of the human as biological man. She regards this development as the linchpin of the present organization of disciplines of knowledge, according to which the human is only an ontophylogenetic organic entity. Alternatively, Winters refers to this matrix as the biocentric ethnoclass, ethnobiological, and ethnodisciplines, or system of ethno-knowledge. she has also pointed out the following. Once Fanon has said ontogeny and sociogeny, every discipline that you practice ceases to exist. If we give this thinking and etymology its due weight, then it is best to render Fanon's espace d'homme as genre of humans, a la Sylvia Winters. So that the passage now reads, decolonization is very simply the replacing of one species of humanity by another species of humanity. Now, before proceeding, I want to take a break. For a moment at least. And in that break, elaborate a point of interpretive methodology with a pertinent historical bearing. The methodology I wish to consider, however cursorily I will consider it, and it will be cursory, is that of one James Yaki Sales, who in his meditations on Frantz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth, New African Revolutionary Writings, suggests reading the chapters of Wretched of the Earth in poignantly non-sequential manner. But first, before taking up his method, a word on the historical purchase I refer to, which will explain why I think Sales' method of reading is pertinent to the matter at hand. The initial introduction of Fanon's writings in the English language world was through the activity of various radical movements in the West. Chief among them, indeed principal in that dissemination, was the Black Panther Party, which made Wretched of the Earth functionally the Bible of decolonization, as Stuart Hall called it. The party disseminated Fanon's thoughts through reading groups, offering analyses for application to the struggle. With the party's suppression, that work moved into the prison system, where Sales, among others, continued to offer instruction in the work aimed at fostering the type of consciousness capable of the social transformation called for in Wretched of the Earth. This radical engagement with Fanon's writing was a particular moment of articulation in a long tradition of black radicalism that was eclipsed but not foreclosed on by the ascendancy of the academic post-colonial studies, appropriation, and interpretation of his work. That appropriation occurred in tandem with the academic disciplining of black studies as Afro and then African American literary studies. Recognizable instituting moments of this disciplining are the establishment of Yale's Afro-American Literature major in 1968, followed by the theoretical and methodological elaboration of the field at the 1977 Yale Seminar on Afro-American Literary Theory. The Yale Afro-American Literary Theory was pointedly a stripping of the radical Fanon from the scholarly study of the black experience, what Henry Louis Gates describes in his introduction to the proceedings of the 1977 seminar as an attempt to take the Mau-Mauing out of black literary criticism. He expanded the scope of that project rather eloquently in his 1991 critical inquiry essay, Critical Fanonism, attacking the post-colonialist investment in Fanon's work as academic and pseudo-oppositional. Gates' essay draws a hard line between the two fields of post-colonial and multicultural ethnic studies, dismissing Wretched of the Earth as being of marginal pertinence to the second of these. This totally academic struggle for resources has little connection with the radical tradition on Fanon, except as a counterforce, or the instrument of a counter-tendency. Indeed, if we recognize both post-colonial and multicultural ethnic studies as functions of neoliberalism, then their relation to the radical engagement with Fanon's work can be understood as counter-revolutionary, functioning to interrupt or interfere with the epistemic rupture his work sought to facilitate. One is compelled to remark, even if only in passing, the perversity of this turn, given the centrality of the Wretched of the Earth in the conceptualization of the nation's first program of black studies, which was not at Yale, but at San Francisco State University in 1968, under the directorship of Nathan Hare, a name we should never forget. As a result of the student strike coordinated by the Third World Liberation Front, which was a coalition of the Black Students Union, the Latin American Students Organization, the Filipino American Students Organization, and El Renancimiento, the SFU program became the nation's first autonomous department of black studies and ethnic studies. The ethnic studies clause was conceived of by Hare as a compromise between the Third World Liberation Front's insistence, with considerable input from George Mason Murray, who was at the time the Black Panther Party's National Minister of Education and a prominent proponent of implementing the party's curriculum of Third World Humanism, which is what they called it then. We can discuss what they meant by that in the question and answer. All of which was predicated on Fanon's call for a new humanism. Murray's role in the development of an expanded black studies curriculum was central, having been hired in September of 1968 by the then SFU president Robert Smith as a teaching assistant in what amounted to a remedial or bridge English class for the 400 or so black and Latino students that the college had just admitted. And he was hired just 8 days prior to Smith's instituting program of black studies. He was indeed, Murray, at the center of the storm that would follow. As a result of Murray's having made some very specific statements in his capacity as a public figure in the party against the Vietnam War and American imperialism, the trustees of SFU pressed Smith and told Smith to reassign him to a non-academic position. Smith refused. But the chancellor pressed him further, and reluctantly he was compelled to suspend Murray, which he did in November 1st, 1968. 14 years to the day after the commencement of the Battle of Algiers. The Third World Federation strike began 4 days later, calling for the enlarged Black Studies program as well as Murray's reinstatement. Now, the process of the institution and trajectory of Yale's Afro-American literary studies was, we can say, far less rancorous and more of an organic development of Yale College. In the spring of '68, the Black Student Alliance of Yale submitted a formal proposal to the college administration petitioning for the creation of the major. Yale College Dean George May promptly appointed a planning committee composed of undergraduate students from the BSAY, as well as faculty, and chaired by Robert Dahl. By September of 1968, the new major was established with unanimous college faculty approval. Now, I'm not going to rehearse the details of Yale's department. I have given a careful account of that in the introduction to my first book regarding the 1977 Yale seminar, which, of course, Gates helped organize with Robert Steptoe. I'll simply repeat some of my remarks that I made there about McGregor Bundy's, then chair of the Ford Foundations, expressly subordinating the political force of black studies to the methodological imperatives of its totalizing work, to the idea that Dilthey had of Geisteswissenschaften. There's a young scholar named Nick Mitchell who's finishing up a book. He's gotten into the archives. He found that line in my introduction, said, is this really true? And there's extensive memos that show that this was a very specific project, that the Ford project to help African American scholars was about ending this political thrust, right? Which, if you read Bundy's remarks at the time, he's very clear. This is what he calls scholarship, and it introduces a tension that many of us who are from that era recall between excellence and political engagement. Gates claims that the movement McBundy makes displaces the politically driven black aesthetics of the 60s, transforming black literary criticism, to quote Gates again, into a valid field of intellectual inquiry, once again. A claim that Bernard Bell characterizes, and rightly in my judgment, as reactionary. Winter draws our attention to the overarching struggle over what way of thinking will prevail in our world as the keynote of thinking about black being. Moreover, the struggle is between cosmogonies, as she puts it, and I mean when I quote her here to invoke Alejo Carpentier's the putative creator of magical realism, but more properly rendered as marvelous realism, realismo glorioso, here with this term of cosmogonies. And cosmogonies that have unfolded on common historical grounds. In other words, it is a struggle of historical formation, of distinct sets of life practices that may share comparable, even identical values, but have arrived at them along different courses. And those courses matter. Those practices that are alternative to and in opposition to the epistemology of, let's call it raciology following Gilroy, we will call here practices of freedom. And their scholarly engagement, the black studies of being. So to close this lengthy parenthesis, Gates's subsequent differentiation between revolutionary and what we must now recognize as third world humanism and identity-based ethnic multicultural studies is a continuation of the reactionary move he made in 1977. Returning back to our engagement with Sayles then, and his reading method. That method suggests reading Fanon in the following manner, and here I'll simply quote him. First, read the preface. Then read chapter 1, 2, and 5 as parts of a whole. Then read chapters 3, 4, and 4a, and this is Sayles' notation for citing the section of chapter 4 entitled Reciprocal Bases of National Culture and the Fight for Freedom, also as part of a whole. Then read 1a, Sayles' notation for citing the section of chapter 1 entitled Violence in the International Context, which is not so much about violence as it is about reparations. And the conclusion. Again, 1a and the conclusion are, he contends, parts of a whole. The aim in this order of reading is to keep in constant purview the voices Fanon uses throughout the text, which Sayles identifies as three. First is the voice of the native or Negro, who during the colonial period, before the fighting starts, avoids confrontation with colonialism and directs all physical and psychological violent impulses inwardly, while being envious of the position of the colonialist. The second is the voice of the ex-native or ex-Negro, who having decided to redirect physical and psychological violence towards the colonialist, is not yet fully conscious, suffers setbacks, and allows the betrayals of the bourgeois forces that claim to speak for and to lead the struggle. The third voice is the voice of the person, and that's Sayles' term, who has overthrown colonialism only to now confront neocolonialism, realizing that national independence isn't the end of the struggle, and that the fully new people will develop only with the construction of the fully new social order. Reading in this way, The Wretched of the Earth takes us through a processes of decolonization, through stages of struggle for independence and social revolution that, speaking in the privative, is not a linear providential progression a la Hegel or Marx, moving instead from focused descriptions of moments of consciousness. In Sayles' account of this movement, at one point Fanon will be talking about conditions and consciousness characteristic of the period of colonization, or the colonial period, that is the first voice heard during the peaceful stage between colonial conquest and the beginning of the struggle to decolonize. He'll then move to some reference and discussion of the decolonization period between the beginning of the struggle and the winning of independence, and he will do so without recognizable signs of transition. And in the third chapter, according to Sayles, Fanon moves from the decolonizing stage to the post-independence or neo-colonial stage, and then back again. This anachronicity applies to the major themes as well, so that violence is not left just to the first chapter, but runs throughout the text. Spontaneity of violence is taken up initially in chapter 1. So too is the racism and Manichaean ideologies. The key insight Sayles achieves with this method is that what is being accounted for in The Wretched of the Earth is the process and the stages in the evolution of people's consciousness, social revolution and social development. In other words, by reading The Wretched of the Earth as Sayles does, we undergo a process of conceptual decolonization isomorphic with the material process exposited in the book. Fanon's narrative performs, or at least incites, conceptual decolonization. This, of course, is the pedagogical force of mimesis. And I mean to invoke here the deep history of this term from Plato on. Sales expressly sets out to unleash. Perhaps we can discuss later why this is an unleashing, as in putting into flight, rather than a harnessing in a hermeneutics of allegoresis. I presented this methodological note here precisely because it is a performative engagement with what Fanon struggled so hard to conceive and engage in his effort to think about, or if you will, theorize the global historical significance of the Algerian Revolution a little more than half a century ago. What are the conditions of possibility for the sustainable articulation of the creative, free, revolutionary subject, the humanist self? Let me remind you, we are still dwelling with the term espace. And what we can take from Fanon stating, la décolonisation est très simplement le remplacement d'un espace de homme pour notre espace. And following Sales, I propose that to do so we must read across text, taking the entirety of Fanon's oeuvre as providing an account of the historical, the conditions of possibility for the sustainable articulation of the creative, free, revolutionary subject, the humanist self. Accordingly, I point out that for Fanon, this is a question of the concrete, or that which is caught between the infinite and nothingness, to put it in the existential phenomenological language he deploys in Peau Noire Masque Blanc, Black Skin, White Mask. The concrete are the actual historical circumstances, and for Fanon this means the concatenation of the developmental determinants of species phylogeny, those of individual ontogeny, as in the particularities of a certain unfolding self-awareness, and those of sociogeny. These realities, to paraphrase Sartre, one of Fanon's key interlocutors, are of a very particular or peculiar nature. They all indicate immediately an essential relation of human reality to the world. They all indicate an aspect of being as it appears to the human being who is engaged in the world. In his preface to The Wretched of the Earth, Sartre writes of Fanon's new humanity, the new man knows that his life as a man begins with death. We find our humanity this side of death and despair. We find it on the other side, he finds it rather, on the other side of torture and death. Offspring of violence, he draws every moment of his humanity from it. We were men at his expense. He becomes a man at ours. Another man, a man of higher quality. These are peculiar lines at this point in time, given what just happened a few days ago. And I'm going to argue, of course, a profound misreading and a dangerous one. Yet, Sartre here gets Fanon quite wrong. The new humanism eschews founding our humanity on the privative proposition, I am not that other thing. Or the corollary, I am because you are not. Rather, Fanon's proposition is that the human emerges in the radical act of mimesis. The self is articulated in relation to things and others in a dynamic interaction that expresses interiority or self-awareness. But if that self-awareness is functional, it is not so in Hegel's sense of the phenomenology of psyche. Neither is it merely sociogenetic or even onto and phylogenetic. The sheer scope and totality of colonial violence so distresses pre-existing socialities that what is revealed is the radical as in fundamental primary activity of Homo sapiens. The expression of self in relation to things through mimesis. The statement, I am not, is the most radical philosophical statement. It is the privative statement that underwrites the colonialist self-awareness, and it is the legitimating force for the colonialist violence. The new man emerges from the no longer colonized assertion, I am as I make myself. Now, I'm pressed for time, so I'm going to jump ahead to the issue of the tabula rasa. And the question of violence, which for Fanon is primarily about an effort to try and recollect at an existential level the event of experience, and from there articulate in a very profound way a different anthropology, a different understanding of life, and a different form of living. And in order to understand the relationship between violence and the event, in terms of politics, we must first keep in mind that when Fanon is concerned with the question of experience in black skin, white mask, for instance, it is always with regard to Hegel, and hence to existence. That is to say, he is concerned with what Hegel called the experience of consciousness. But Fanon is quite emphatic about the inapplicability of Hegel's conception of experience to the colonial situation. For instance, in the opening pages of L'Expérience vécue du Noir, the experience of blackness in Black Skin, White Mask, he writes, as long as the black is with his own, he will not have occasion, with the exception of petty internal struggles, to experience his existence for others. There is undoubtedly the moment of existence for another that Hegel speaks of, but all ontology is rendered unrecognizable in a society colonized and civilized. There is an impurity of the Weltanschauung of the colonized people that interdicts all ontological expectation and explication. Someone could perhaps object that this is so for every individual, but that obscures a fundamental problem. Ontology, when it has admitted setting aside existence once and for all, does not permit us to understand the existence of the black. For the black no longer has to be black, but must be it in the perception of the white. Some may take it in their heads to respond to us that the situation is reciprocal. We respond that that is false. The black has no ontological resistance in the eyes of the white. Famous lines. The formulation, que le noir n'est plus être noir, for the black no longer has to be black, is subtle and enigmatic. The subject of the sentence, of course, is the black. Its action is the negation of being black. The negation is occurring now, and as such is pointing to something that has been. This is made more accessible if we ask the implied question, what is the black now? The answer given here is that the black now is not what he was. Black. In other words, when we try to speak about what the black is now, we can only point to what the black has been. What has been is not, so it can be now, only by virtue of the fact that its having been is negated by us. The black that Fanon is speaking of is thus the negation of the black that he meant now. This is a denegation, the point of which is not simply to establish that there is a paradox of sense certainty revealed by language when speaking of how the black no longer has to be black, but that that play of language entails an attitude of perception which is not the black's. Fanon writes in the subordinate clause, but must be it in the perception of the white. Being black as in vis-a-vis or in front of, as in the presence of the white, is to be something black for the white. This is not the black in itself for itself. The negation draws our attention to where Fanon wants it, on the process of becoming that is consciousness of the black. But this consciousness has no ontological status in perception of the white, nor should it at all. I mean, at the risk of losing a couple of moments, I mean, this is an amazing thing still that it endures today. I mean, in some conversation, in some circles, we assert in this country now that we were better off under segregation because one escapes the gaze. And the way in which there's the ubiquity of the media gaze that defines what one is, which is always in perspective to a dominant anthropology that is completely ignorant of its own historicity, right? Which is, of course, why, to speak very quickly and perhaps opportunistically, the assertion of Black Life Matters is lost in a kind of obscurity, right? And it gets two responses. All life matters, which is absurd. And another response, to whom are you talking, which is more pertinent. Right? The fact that the statement must be made, it matters, is marking a shift away from the possibility of revolutionary consciousness that Fanon is discovering here. What Fanon is discovering here, he's trying to say that there's something going on in these historical processes among these populations that's articulating something else as another way through modernity. Understanding how this works means dwelling a little bit more with the distinction Fanon wants to make between objects and sense certainty of those perceptions. And that would require going into a long excursus about his problematic of the body. I'll just condense that, because I want to get at what's really at stake there, which is the question of the flesh. And in his considering of the body, he has that specific account of the crisis that's precipitated by that remark the young boy makes, right? Tien ou nègre, right? And that French term nègre is a very interesting term. Right. I mean, it really does carry the full valence, including nigger. Right. Which is really quite interesting. In my years of living in France, I was never called nègre. I was called bico, which is also a peculiar kind of play on this, right? Sale arabe. I was expecting the James Baldwin experience, but as one fascist explained to me, no, you're not tall enough, you don't walk right, and you've got half moons on your eyes. Vous êtes maître nègre comme les Marocains. Huh? It seems to be based on, this crisis seems to be based on the Martiniquais discovering himself as both being in itself and being for itself, echoing Du Bois's remark, who makes good use of Benet's early work on multiple personalities on double consciousness. And let us bear in mind here that before Du Bois comes to this formulation, precipitated somehow by the little girl's rejection of his gift, he has already posited the fundamental problematic of the meaning of being black. That is, he has posited that the principal issue is the nature and conditions for a specific type of self-awareness in the world. Then again, given Fanon's hyper-investment in language as the material actualization of consciousness, as well as his cryptic reference to the Martiniquais' metaphysics, along with his assertion that the black has no ontological resistance for the white, which means that there is no apparent opacity of language, and so intimation of intersubjectivity. That is quite absurd. It is more likely that what he is postulating is that Tiano Negre reveals what I will call here the conventionality of self-consciousness, or more precisely, the poetic sociality of self. That it cannot be reduced to either pure physicality, biology, or abstraction, ideas as negation, and that conventions are constitutively inclusive in their actuality, that even with those predicated on and articulating the radical exclusionary taxonomies, say family, clan, tribe, or even race, in their articulation interpolate in the sense of bring to mind, as in way of thinking, those who are excluded. The Martiniquais is self-conscious in accord with the determinations of French language. Simply put, according to Sartre's elaboration of the dialectic of nothingness, the Martiniquais can say, this is nothing, I am not this, all of which puts Fanon's rehearsal of the Martiniquais mother's scolding her son to not act like a nigger in a more interesting light than it is usually seen to be. The entire French language, or more along the lines of Fanon's analysis, the modern French bourgeois language, pivots on a fundamental negation according to the convention of which the assertion I am follows from the negation not this nègre. Fanon's problem with Sartre then is his reversing the order, making being always prior to negation, which is Sartre's correction of Hegel. The movement here is highly complicated because while Fanon is not returning to Hegel in terms of the genealogy of the actualization of consciousness, he concurs with Sartre. For the presentation of consciousness with the species, being is prior to nothing. Still, he is remarking Sartre's failure to attend to the question in relation to real historical circumstance. In the actual history of bourgeois French consciousness, negation is prior to, or at least concurrent with being. Being black, to again reference Du Bois's phrasing, is being in and not through or by negation. It is articulated in the set of relations put into play and described by the privative without occupying or settling into the assigned place. It is being in flight. To take a phrasing recently put forward by Fred Moten, black being, that is blackness, is the disavowal of standpoint. It is being unfettered by standpoint, while at the same time under siege for not having one. The point is that there is no viable materialist account of absolute human being, but only one of actualized ways of human being. Or as Sylvia Wynter again has remarked, once you say, besides ontogeny, there is sociogeny, there cannot be only one mode of human being. There are multiplicities of modes of being. Achieving a proper global way entails a radical reimagining of conventionalities, of the relationship between conventionalities, of the possibilities of consciousness. 5 more minutes. While I concur with Winter's statement, there is another aspect of Fanon's thinking I care to draw attention to. The issue at stake in Fanon's account of the incongruence between his subjective experience of bodily being and that of his conventionally determined subjectivity, Tiens de Negre, is not just the normative man, the bourgeois consciousness arrived at through a particular symbolic order. Fanon, socialized through his bourgeois education to be man, and therefore to be normal, must experience himself in doubly conscious terms as being both norm and other. The issue at stake is the conditions of consciousness, which is to say, he is after a materialist phenomenological account of pre-reflective consciousness or self-awareness, in which the issue of gentrification or genre, as I've tried to lay it out, has to be brought into play. And that account, in correlating philology, ontogeny, and sociogeny, offers a theory of self-awareness that is bodily as well as linguistic. That is the function of dynamic interaction of bodily perception and conventional engagement. That is neither reductionist in the cognitive scientist mode, nor phenomenological in Sartre's mode. In other words, Fanon's concern, at least in part, is to explain how we gain first-person knowledge of our experiences. The dispute over higher order unilinear representational two-act or two contents of representation and physicalist accounts of self-awareness as a condition of consciousness is about the conditions of ethical formation of being. One is caught in an ethical relation. And to be so is to be caught in an economy of relations of freedom that values index. The point is not to establish Fanon as a phenomenologist, but rather to establish that his exploration of the problem of image and perception relative to language and the body in the real historical circumstance of imperial racism, that is the black, is objectively compelled to a necessary inner self-awareness that is in tension with his consciousness, and that tension is a function of the discrepancy inhering in the symbolic order. Fanon, however, is not concerned here in general terms with the human condition per se. Rather, he is accounting for self-awareness, for embodied self-awareness, which is somehow put into crisis by a speech act that reveals an order of representation that simply precludes this embodied self, while taking up the phenomenality of the body as correlate with consciousness. There is a determinate psychological state attributed to the nega, and there are a list of them: indolence, stupidity, that cannot be identified with the embodied self. There is fleshliness, as in the Arkansas Freedman, Tom Wyndham's remark in 1937, "We deserve our liberty because us is human flesh." The question becomes again, à la Sartre, what am I? And how is Sartre's formulation of the apprehension stemming from the for itself, apprehending itself as not being its own foundation? And this apprehension is at the basis of every cogito, not like Fanon's formulation of the apprehension stemming from the Martiniquais apprehending himself as not being his own foundation. The difference here is what I want to call restlessness, an appeal to consciousness. To quote a hemsis from the 10th century Abbasid poet al-Mutanabi's qasida, بقاء شيء ليس هم ارتحال. Thankfully, they are not willing migrants. فما حولت في أرض مقام ولا أزمعت عن أرض زوال على قلق كأن ريح تحت أجواؤها جنوب وشمال. Paraphrase. I have not tried to establish fixed residence in any one place as a homeland, because I am in transit from one homeland to another while still at home, restless, على قلق, as if riding the wind, steering south or north. This is not a metaphor for perpetual travel from one place to another. Not having tried to establish a homeland means that there is no necessity to decide to leave, nor is it a figure of exile. Rather, it is a figure of being transitionally in being, or existentially transitional. And those of you who know the tradition, this is precisely how Ralph Ellison describes the Negro, to be in transition. This is this black being. Or to stick with sales language, this is the voice of conscious. Thank you.
So we have some time now for Q&A.
Thank you very much for this talk. It's really profound and magnificent. And the answer to my question may just simply be no. which I'll grant to start. But I'm wondering, given the formulation that you've made, whether it might be, I'd love to hear this, but whether it might be productive, or if it's not, then why not, to remember Fanon in his guise as a psychoanalyst as well, where the restlessness and the poetic sociality that you identify is operating, let's say, in the schematic framework of something like the mirror phase, or the sort of idea of identification as essentially a psychotic formulation, right? I mean, he started off writing about thought disorder in the African syndrome, and I'm wondering if that framing and thinking about Fanon also as a political psychoanalyst, according himself to some kind of other set of frameworks, might be actually a really interesting way to think this through as well. It seems to be, it seems to be viable, right? And I like to champion Fanon as a psychoanalyst as well.
As Fanon himself said, man is not a negation. So
yeah.
The answer to your question is yes. I mean, the section that I couldn't read was precisely the importance of the psychoanalysis and arguing against the distinction that Gates makes, which occurs at many levels, between Fanon the psychoanalyst and Fanon the revolutionary theorist, right? Which parallels the distinction between black studies as being only psychoanalytical and revolutionary studies belonging to post-colonial as being foreign and should be eschewed and being radical and being problematic, right? Which does a violence to Fanon. I've been trying for the past 5 years to get access to his case notes, which are still in Tunisia. And it's very difficult because among the patients who he treated, a couple are still alive. So it's parental privilege, right? I and a couple of other Tunisians, right? Because in his case notes, it's rumored, there's a great deal of discussion about these issues, right? And in his case notes, it's not just that he understands, and here he's following Lacan, that modernity generates psychoses, right? So that the psychoses that he explores in terms of negrophobia, which is also the psychoses of society at large, right, is precisely that's why there must be a new anthropology. That's why there must be a new humanism to correct this. And that he carries into his psychoanalytical work, right, in the notes. So I agree completely, it's very important. And one of the focuses on the book is to try to redeem that. We've yet to have a full publication of that work and in its integration into it. So although his daughter calls for it and others who work with him, Shakri, one of them has pointed to that. We have to correct how Mamie mischaracterized Fanon in this regard, and mischaracterized the work. So the short answer is yes, you're absolutely right.
Words, when they enter general use, take on very different meanings. So the dame de la terre is not the same thing as the regiment here. It's very different. It's sort of like the use of struggle on sports channels. Struggle always means floundering, having a moral failure. If we are struggling, it means that we have somehow neglected our responsibility. But when we look at Eleanor Flexner's century of struggle, then struggle means something heroic. Or when we look at Teddy Roosevelt's social Darwinism, struggle is the process whereby we become stronger. And it's necessary. If the Civil War is a struggle for right against wrong. Wretchedness is, I had occasion to look it up in Webster's, Merriam-Webster, 7th this morning, and it's a pejorative term. It doesn't simply mean, it seems that generally now I have a very close friend now who thinks of struggle, of wretched, meaning the wretched refers to those who are deprived of their heritage by colonialism. It has come to mean this, but to use it in the way that Alexander Crummell used it in the 19th century, that miserable wretch, that contemptible cur. No longer does it, in some circles, it can no longer be used that way. And so the transformation of words is very important. It's the way that within I'm not that old, I'm only 73, and yet in the past 50 years, I've just seen so many transformations of the language. And not only since I speak a smattering of a couple of other languages, it's just amazing to me to see how these words have changed in other languages too. Can we speak of the difficulty of these terms? Genius, the Negro genius, famous book written in 1939 by Benjamin Brawley. But the Negro genius in the term, wow, it just means so many different things. It's one of the few words that has a similar meaning in Arabic and in English. But how can we, I don't want to go back 30 years to the era of deconstructionism, but how do we actually communicate? I mean, how can we be certain we're not somehow distorting what Henry Louis Gates might have said 30 years ago, because our language and our way of proceeding has changed since then?
Okay, that last one was a curveball.
Sir?
The last one was a curveball. So I'll mark it and try and hit it. But let me hit the soft lobs first, right? Yes, of course. I made a decision in the presentation, which I'm regretting now, because in the work of the text, I very deliberately refer to it as Les Dames de la Terre, precisely because of my disagreement with Farrington's translation and the mores and presumptions about social organization behind them that bears over Fanon's work to articulate, in keeping with Aben Ramadan, who brought him into the struggles proposition, that it is the peasantry and the people in their abjectness, and I tried to get it when I talked about it, brings them down to a point in which the fundamental species activity of mimesis is exposed, are creating an order, right? So Les Damnés plays with that. There's a kind of double sens that's at work there. That wretchedness loses. That wretchedness loses. But I thought it would be, I didn't know the audience to just sit here and, you know, Peau Noire Masque Blanc, Les Dames de la Terre, etc., without a long explanation of why, which would have lost the moment of pointing out the central point. Now that may be self-serving, but it's an honest response to that. Now on the curve, and so the question of language I'm very attentive to, and especially the question of translation and movement, right? I'm not misreading Skip. Skip's been pretty persistent on this, very clear. He was clear in 1977 when he and Robert did that piece. He was clear in 1991 when he launched that major attack in critical Fanonism. He was clear in 1996 in the New Yorker piece, where in his introduction, he expressly allies black culture with American exceptionalism and empire, when he says that we're in the New World Order, we've reached the end of history, and when we talk about American culture dominating the world, it's black American culture, so I can say we're speaking of he's been very, very clear and consistent in his notion that there must be this hard distinction between, let's call it loosely, an aesthetic, but I put that in quotes, right, versus a political agenda and the demaming. That's not a misreading. And what's important about that is precisely the continuity of its valence across a 30 or 40-year period. Why is that important? Because it marks the way in which the moment we're in and the politics we're in are still playing out old issues. In other words, it gives us a deep history, an extended history. Right? And that's important to track the history of words. There's the issue of the etymology of words, and there's the issue of the history of words, which is part of what you're deploying. So I agree with you, and then I say, no, I'm not misrecalling, mistranslating, misconstruing Skip, but I'm calling attention to what he's saying, precisely marking the movement of the history of words.
Well, I don't think you're misconstruing, because
No, I didn't take your, I said curve, I didn't say fastball. So I, you know, I didn't take it as being, it wasn't a spitball. There was no malice in your question, and I didn't take it that way, and it wasn't, no, it was an honest question. I'm exploiting the question. I'm being opportunistic to say, you know, yeah. And agreeing with you in the movement about the question of language and the history of language in terms. And so it's important that he goes from Afro-American to African-American. Right? And it's important that this is done in a time frame in 1968 when they're looking at San Francisco State and they're saying, we have to stop that. Right? And so that momentum, which is a momentum of what? It's precisely what Fanon talked about. The people's intelligence emerging into the academy to try to form anew. I mean, one of the reasons I'm interested in this right now is what's going on in Tunisia, where I'm actively involved, right? And there's a project I've been dealing with now for the past 4 years, and we're going to have our next event in the spring about the Arab revolutions. In fact, it's my coinage. الثورات العربية والإنسانية الجديدة. The Arab revolutions and the new humanism. And it's focused on the ways in which the events of the revolution are an occasion that may fail, it may succeed, to reimagine the humanities as a social institution that produces a particular kind of individual. The phrase al-qalqin, restlessness, comes from that Mutanabi line, but it's deployed by Mahmoud al-Mas'adi, the great novelist and playwright and poet, who was the executor and quasi-architect of the Bourguiba reform of '58 that produced those individuals who did the insurrection in 2010. And it produced it very violently. Bourguiba crushed traditional society and compelled a certain kind of humanistic education, right? And then Mas'adi says the aim was to produce individuals who are restless. Because once they're restless and they have knowledge, the pedagogical project, and you burden them with this literary tradition of humanism, which in that reform was bilingual, French and Arabic, you produce individuals who must embrace the responsibility of life and living in relationship to others. So the investment in the question of language here is precisely with an eye towards that concrete project of the moment. How can we make humanities different? And so that movement of skip, that shutting down of that revolutionary project, is something we have to pay attention to in the hopes of, even in our moment, Black Life Matters. In our moment of diversity on campus, in our moment of profound crises of humanities where it doesn't know where to go, right? And there may be, I don't know how I got there. Your passion is contagious.
No, I think we know where it's going. We know where it's
Thanks so much for your talk. I guess I just wanted to push a bit on what seemed to be a really big claim and central to you. You said it, I think, just once, which was that colonial violence is so drastic that it reveals this sort of fundamental, I think that was the word used, activity.
Species activity.
Which is mimesis. And you just didn't explicitly return to that, and I'd like you to just say a bit more and link it to this restlessness and the newness of the new humanism that you see yourself engaged in, how this understanding of the fundamental activity of humans, if that's your view, I wasn't even sure because it was quite brief, how new is that claim? What does it allow us to do with humanism that is so different?
Very good, very, very good question. Thank you for that. And it is my claim, and it's also Fanon's, right? He says, I'm a poet of the world, I make myself. Very quick thumbnail. I have a very specific reading of Aristotle's notion of mimesis. And the book I'm working on now, the whole question of mimicry is central here. Where he lays out mimesis as this is the activity by which humans world, right, use symbolic forms, whatever they may be, materially, to articulate the world and themselves in the world. And in Fanon's analysis, the violence of colonialism so destroys, and it's part of what capitalism does, antecedent symbolic orders that have existed for a long time, that are gendered in certain ways. And we know he was wrong about the revolutionary potential to change the gender relations. But he thought that it would do that. It would just tear it up, right? And when it tears it up, what's left is this basic activity by which we make ourselves human, right? And the question is how that activity, unleashed again, can articulate a different kind of order. Right? Now, my investment in that has, again, to do with the issue of poetic socialities and the ways in which very specific practices, it's not abstract, إذا أشاب يوم أراد الحياة, right? The day the people want life, right? Which is, of course, what gave us that brief summary couplet that we all know. الشعب يريد سقوط نظام, right? Which comes out of that very important Shaybi Qasida. These are moments in which those poetic expressions actually constituted in the act of their utterance and their mimetic and their reception collectivities that did stuff. This is what happened in the streets of Sidi Bouzid, and repeatedly over the course of 2 years, it happened in different streets in Tunisia and around the world, and it's still happening, right? There is a name for this that the Arabic language Aristotelians coined long before Adorno and Rancière, al-umma shi'ariyya, coming out of Aristotle's notion of mimesis. The poetic or the affective community. And al-Farabi, in analyzing it, and even Ibn Rushd understands that force of poetic expression to excite tahyir, human imagination, and to constitute spontaneous collectives. They're not political in the sense that we understand. They don't become political, institutionalized and permanent, can affect social change in the political order, right? And that's what I'm after in pushing Fanon on how this species activity of mimesis is always, it never goes away. Whatever the order is, the moment it's gone, we will cease to exist point blank as a species. So it's a way of reimagining the structure of society, right? To speak still very quickly, the state has transformed, so it's not the nation state, but the state still exists, and the state is still important in order to regulate the elements of our insanities. What just happened in Paris points to this, right? But what has changed is the relationship between the state and what Hegel called civil society, and the nature of society. And what I'm trying to get at through this with Fanon is an understanding of society as spontaneous collectivities that come and go, right? And then from there you ask the question, well, what can then be the basis of the common, of such fundamental things like affect, attachment, or to use a very specific term, affiliation? What kind of love is this, right? And so I'm trying to articulate a different kind of love. When I say different from the Pauline, different from the Ioannine, different from the Enlightenment concept of love, all of which presuppose a sort of static essential identity, for a love that can be spontaneous and changing, and a love supreme. Or Clarence Carter's love. I'm not being flippant. I mean this, right? Because there's a long practice of black love that's in the blues. This is about this kind of. I love you today, but not tomorrow. But I'll love you forever. Right? Where there is no sacrifice. And there is no propriety. So it's an improper love.
I think we can do one more, maybe short question. Yeah.
In the kind of large scholarship on Fanon, there's often a kind of a very strong distinction made between black skin and white mask. That's almost made out to be a kind of epistemological break, a kind of existentialist early text, and a later kind of more Marxist materialist text. And I was kind of wondering whether you see that distinction yourself, and whether that whether the kind of restlessness that you're describing appears differently in the two texts.
Yeah, I must apologize. I'm sorry. I was obviously not coherent. Because my whole point is to reject that distinction, right? And its genealogy is traceable, right? We see this with Albert Memmi in Revue Esprit in September of 1971. He introduces it, right? And everyone picks it up, including Macy, right? And it's rather pernicious, right? Because and it's one of the questions I want to get at. The whole discourse is about Fanon trying to escape his negritude, his blackness, and being uncomfortable in his blackness, and that's why he's trying in this Marxist movement, Algerian movement, which was the underlying presumptions of that need to be explored, because, and the point I'm making here that Fanon makes is, blackness is not a condition that one wants to escape from. Exactly, exactement, mais c'est ça, right? And so that huge scholarship is what I'm pushing against. Right, pushing against, because that's been part of what I call the post-colonial effort to defang Fanon. Right, and Gates jumps on board, so now we get, okay, so let the Negroes have peau noire masque blanc, and it's all about a certain kind of psychosis. And the revolutionary stuff is irrelevant now. We're in the New Age. That's Fanon, the bloodthirsty, violent one. Look, that's the Bible that led to the debacle of third worldism. Well, no, it's Cabral who's reading Fanon. right? I mean, the aspects of Fanon, what Fanon's trying to do, never get realized. It shouldn't be identified with the debacle of third worldism. You know, it's the fact that Fanon was thinking these things with Ramdan, that there can be the intelligence of the people, that led to Ramdan's being assassinated by the generals of the National Liberation Army, and then they tried to assassinate Fanon, right? And so the scholarship you're talking about repeats that gesture. It's complicit. And I'm including David Macy.